Can I ask you all to come to order? Thank you very much for joining today. We have two very interesting speakers to talk about the economic outlook for 2017, and we've told both of our speakers to feel free to touch on whatever part of the economy and the economic outlook they would like to discuss. So I'm sure they will have interesting comments in their areas and counterplay nicely together. So let me first introduce our two speakers. Dr. Shirakawa is chief economist for Japan at Credit Suisse. He is well known to the club. He is very kindly comes on a regular basis, always has interesting views. He speaks forthrightly, I would say, and so I'm sure he will give us some more direct views of where he thinks things are headed for the new year. Ms. Takeda is a first-time speaker at the club, and so we welcome her. She's a senior economist at the Institute for International Monetary Affairs, a very well-known, respected research institute, dates back to 1995. So we are going to ask her to please kick off with a presentation. I gather you're going to touch mainly on foreign exchange, which is certainly a topic in the news today. If anyone checked the rates overnight, you will find you're either much richer or poorer than you were the night before. So Ms. Takeda will probably be able to give you some clues on whether you are going to get better or worse off. So please, can we go to you? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind introduction. So it is indeed a great honor as well as pleasure to have this opportunity to speak at FCCJ. So thank you very much for having me here today. And today I am going to talk about the Japanese yen foreign currency outlook. As we have all seen that after the election victory of Mr. Trump, the financial market being reacted by higher equity prices, higher treasury yields, and higher dollar. So the question is this sustainable? Or the Japanese perspective that does the Japanese yen strengthen again? Or make the Japanese yen great again? Is the topic that I'm going to share today. So what's on page 2 of my handouts is the checklist or the diagnosis of very conventional FX determinants. So of course, I understand that for all of us, the economic policies of Trump administration and its impact on economy is the biggest concern. However, the details are not. So it's very uncertain. And we are not able to produce any convincing and complete assumptions on it yet. So given this, I would like to try this checklist, the ordinary conventional FX determinants, in the viewpoint that what will remain unchanged in such a quickly changing circumstances. So to put the conclusions first, what happened during the past 5 weeks are, of course, the dollar appreciation, though the one-way weakening of the Japanese yen is unlikely, I think. So the current dollar appreciation is a mere, hope, the product of a mere hope, and expectations, and the speed may be excessive compared to the actual fundamental changes. So as listed on page 2, there are lots of yen supporting factors as well. So the course of the dollar yen next year would be very bumpy. So we at the Institute set the forecast range of the dollar yen from 105 to 125. So we'll see some room for the yen to strengthen again. And the dollar will try the higher side toward early next year. But latter half of the year, the pace of the dollar appreciation will lose steam. So let me discuss on these points in my presentations. So to begin with, the charts on page 3 confirms the sharp reaction at dollar yen market after the election. So the black line is the actual performance of dollar yen, And the green line is the 52-week moving average. That means 1 year moving average, which is often referred by Japanese market participants, including me, as a key technical line, the green one. So it has just breached such an important technical line and signaling the shift towards stronger dollar. And needless to say, what's behind this big psychology change is the hopes for a policy mix in the States, the fiscal expansion and monetary tightening. As I said, the tax cut gonna be above $6 trillion and the infrastructure spending over $1 trillion. So these policy expectations accelerated the massive dollar buyings. However, on the other hand, if Mr. Trump keeps his mantra of America first or trade protectionism, the dollar appreciation seems something that should be avoided to support the exporters in the States to encourage the competitiveness of the US exporters. So as said, the implications of Trump policy on dollar yen are very mixed and so uncertain. So that I would like to go over the checklist, the conventional FX determinants, as introduced at the beginning, as a possible guide and to get ready for the future fluctuations. So the top of the checklist on page 2 is the monetary policy. And the monetary policy has been the main focus at the market because the correlation between dollar yen and interest rate differentials are so strong as shown on page 4, let's say on the right-hand side charts. The gray line is dollar yen and the red line is the interest rate differentials on 10 years. So they are just moving in tandem. But to be fair, I should note that these so-called market movers change so often, so we cannot rely on one particular determinant all the time. But as for now, at least, the interest rate differential is the key variable and the most reliable indicator, maybe since April this year, and of course, even after the election, US presidential election as well. So the high correlation with the interest rate differential is, that's the reason why the high focus, all the focus are concentrated on the pace of US monetary policy, as we have seen the result last night, and the pace of their normalization next year. And as Fed proclaimed last night, the market has priced in 2 or 3 rate hikes into 2017. And this seems quite reasonable and as expected, since Mr. Trump inherits very healthy economy, and so more frequent hikes than this year is, of course, it's quite reasonable. But I suppose at the same time, the Fed decision-making process will be cautious, because one of the reasons of my observation that they are going to be very cautious on their decision-making is that the dollar appreciation itself could damage the US economy and will slow the monetary policy tightening. And unlike BOJ, Fed is very open to speak in public about damages of currency appreciations on economic activities. So what's on page 5 is the argumentation. What's on page 5, the 3 charts, this is argumentation made by Stanley Fischer, the Fed vice chair, about the effects of 10% dollar appreciation on US economy. So let's say on the charts on the right-hand side on the top, this chart shows the depth of negative contribution to GDP on 10% dollar appreciation. So it shows that it will damage US GDP by 1.5% in 3 years. That's the assumption made by Fed. Fisher. So this is just one of the examples of authorities' concern over a stronger dollar. But my take here is that there are going to be more hikes than this year into 2017. But the Fed cautious approach will continue next year. And the subject of their cautiousness include the fluctuation of dollar and the impact of the macroeconomy. So they will keep a very watchful eye on the performance of the US dollars. And how about BOJ? Because on Japan, I think Mr. Shirakawa will discuss on that in depth. But as we all have seen that they have introduced a new policy scheme in September called yield curve control. But this is, my observation is that this is the BOJ's answer to the technical bound to continue QQE, the quantitative and qualitative easing that was started in April 2013. So the technical limitation to purchase JGBs and adverse effect on financial institutions on the negative interest policy. This has been the headache for BOJ as well as the financial people in Tokyo for a long time. So they decided to shift the major policy tool from asset purchase to interest rate in September. And thanks to this decision, the sense of flexibility and the continuity has been restored to their easing policies. So given this renewal of the policy and the view that the further easing options are so limited, that they will continue wait and see stance so the immediate additional easing is quite unlikely by BOJ. So all in all, the monetary policy outlook in the States and Japan implicates further dollar appreciation. But the pace of the widening of the interest rate differential will be slowed due to the cautiousness of the Fed to tighten and the cautiousness of the BOJ for further easing. That's the take from the monetary policies. And earlier I mentioned about Stanley Fischer's concern over dollar appreciation, but he's of course not alone to speak about the damages of a stronger dollar. This year in April, the US Treasury started to release the foreign exchange monitoring report as shown on page 7. There, they named 6 nations, which, according to them, have a future possibility to become FX manipulator. That means the country who controls the currency in order to encourage the exporters. So among these 6 countries that painted in green, China, Germany, and Japan has a very large surplus with the US, as well as a current account surplus, or overall current account surplus. So to make the supposition here is that the US government must be unhappy to see the currency depreciation of these countries, especially Chinese renminbi and the Japanese yen. So again, the one-way weakening of Japanese yen against the dollar is unlikely next year because of these US authorities' stance. On the macro side, so I would like to mention about the fiscal, external, and inflation, these variables, because these economic variables have a direct impact on currency values. So the point I would like to make here and share is that the effect of US fiscal expansion on dollar. As you can see by the charts on page 8, there is a clear relationship that improvements in fiscal balance induce currency appreciation, and vice versa, that worsening of fiscal deficit is always followed by dollar weakness. So current market reaction is very biased, I should say, that they are just focusing on the nice and pleasant side of fiscal expansion and ignoring these adverse effects on the US dollars. And on Japan, there is a clear relationship between currency, yen, and the external balance, the current account surplus. What's on page 9 is Japan's external balance. And the charts on the left-hand side is current account balance, the white dotted chart, white dots with black line. And it made, that Japan's current account surplus made a V-shaped recovery from deficit to huge surplus. And so it's now record high, like recording 2 trillion yen per month is the pace of Japan's current account balance. And the charts on the right-hand side, this is the white dot is the current account surplus, and black line is the dollar yen. So lagged by 18 months though, and these two has, in longer term, has certain correlations as well. So So to see, these two external balances, the answer, the implication to foreign exchange market is, of course, the yen appreciation. And as for the inflation front, it's been in Japan, still the year-on-year CPI growth increase is very weak and fragile. And we should say that the deflationary pressures are very persistent in Japan still. And on the other hand, that the U.S. U.S. inflation numbers, we cannot still confirm the inflationary pressures on the macro data yet, of course. But we will, for sure, it will soon be in our sight that thanks to Trump fiscal expansionary policy and maybe wealth effect from higher equity prices and also higher oil prices that been. So on that the inflation front, that rather higher pressures for in the States, but still deflationary strain in Japan. Then what does these inflation index, the CPIs imply to the foreign exchange market is very, again, conventional purchasing power parity stories. If we refer to this PPP, purchasing power parity stories, this is the most trusted theory to judge and explain the currency values in the long run. And in this, the higher inflation implies, of course, the currency weakening. So you can see on page 12, this is the PPP on Japan and US. And historically, the inflationary pressure in Japan is subdued. So the implication from this PPP chart is always yen strengthening, the downward. And what the current situation on the inflation front in the US and Japan is the same. So inflationary pressure in the States and disinflationary power in the yen, that, again, implication is yen strengthening. And another story maybe is the risk aversion thing, because every time some risk aversions at the market, automatically yen has been bought as a safe haven currency. So how come this happens? Is one theoretical explanation behind this is that Japan's huge net external assets. So as you can see by the chart on page 13, Japan is the largest holder of net external assets and the perpetual, recorder of current account surplus. So in the case of the financial crisis, where the squeeze liquidity squeeze at the market, the capital tried to be back to these surplus countries, and the top of the list is Japan. So this is the basic idea why Japanese yen be bought in such circumstances. So in these very, as I listed on page 2, so there are some remaining factors that support the Japanese yen. So the current market force to drive up the US dollar is so strong, but toward the next year, I think it's not one-way bet. So maybe let me stop here. And so my quick summary is that it's, as said, there, toward the next year, there will be occasionally some yen buying pressures at the moment. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Takeda-san. Very interesting. A lot of very solid data in there. I'm sure our guests will have a lot of questions about other factors that may be affecting all this, since foreign exchange is so complicated, and a lot of factors, obviously. But before we go to the questions, can I ask for Dr. Shirakawa to offer his thoughts on where we stand in this year, for the new year?
Yeah, thank you very much. I always, don't use any slides. I'm much more lazy than Takeda-san. So, her presentation was quite impressive, very well organized, and you can be chief economist of us. She actually, has painted the quite interesting view about the currency. A current strength of the dollar or the weakness of the yen will not be just sustained. Several structural factors to cap the yen's dollar strength, or I think to mitigate any upper pressure on the dollar or the weakening on the yen. I totally agree with her view that medium-term trend of the currency has changed much, and yen looks to remain on the gradual appreciation path over longer run. In the short run, I have a slightly different view. From Takeda-san's view, in a sense that this trend, which started right after the election of the U.S., may continue, and of course she does not rule out that possibility, I think. But the yen could touch 130, maybe in 2 months' time. Our quantitative analysis suggests that once the yen moves by more than 10 yen in a month, already like 14 yen, after the election, more than 10 yen is a level shift. We tend to have the kind of the view that if the yen's movement is within 10 yen range against the dollar, that could be a one-off, a possible noise, but more than 10 yen, the level shift, and if the level shift, it is not stopping at 50 yen, for example, maybe 30 yen, depreciation is possible. And right now, I'm very much concerned about the BOJ's stance on the currency or the monetary policy. Governor Kuroda seems still very much in favor of weakening the currency, because the weaker currency is not necessarily only, but one very important sources of inflation in this country. So image is that BOJ will take a wait and see, doing nothing, continue to print money almost at the same pace, and leaving the currency pricing to the markets. Means the yen depreciation could accelerate in a very short run. The question is when Trump administration start to shout, or when the BOJ would say, oh, this is too much for us, the yen's depreciation. I would say not 120, possibly 125, but this crazy central bank may not intervene in a broad sense up to maybe 127, 128. So 130 is quite possible. And that is real, I think, the significant undervaluation of the currency from medium-term perspective. That means the risk of the yen to start appreciate significantly over the coming year or two increases hugely. But in the meantime, in the short run, yen could touch 130 in our view. The point is, if the yen goes down to 130, Bank of Japan, they are always optimistic about the inflation outlook. We do not know their assumption right now for the currency, but if their assumption of the currency is like 100, and if the yen goes down to 130, what they're going to do? They have to upgrade their inflation outlook. So, if you remember the press conference by Kuroda-san back in November 1st, he was quite dark, and everybody questioned about, is it possible for the inflation to hit 2% before you retire? And he said, probably not. But if 130 is the case, and if their working assumption on the economy has been unchanged, what they have to do is now, I think I can achieve 2% inflation before I leave. And what is the BOJ doing in this situation? So the point I would like to make is that for the moment, wait and see. 130 could be the case, but somewhere, at some point, by middle of next year, BOJ would suddenly say, "No, under Kuroda's governorship, we can achieve 2%. So we have to do exit." So, we usually use the word normalization. Normalization of monetary policy can kick in a very short period of time, and very 180 degrees, more or less 180 degrees kind of, change in way of managing monetary policy. Is what? Start to raise 10-year target and taper, and even removing negative interest policy. Of course, it is totally up to the U.S. economic outlook. What is happening to the Federal Reserve? What is happening to the U.S. dollar? But remember that the Fed is now tightening. It doesn't matter much how many times they're going to raise interest rate. The point is they are now more prepared for tightening monetary policy. Why? U.S. jobless rate already come down to 4.6%. And we haven't yet seen any major inflation pressure in the state. But the point is we are already very close to so-called natural rate of unemployment. So risk on the inflation in the U.S. is also an upside. And usually, when the economy gets matured, fiscal and monetary policy has to be normalized, but Trump is not. He's now expanding fiscal policy. Wow, this is not the time for expand the fiscal policy. Wait. We are already in a situation where job shortage is now more visible. Why you want to do fiscal expansion? Means Fed will be forced to hike rates, possibly even at much faster pace than the markets are now pricing, possibly. Because this is a headache for the central bank. They have started to normalize, but because they have not assumed any fiscal stimulus, we can do gradually, gradual rate hike. But fiscal expansion kicking. So the point is how effective the U.S. fiscal policy or fiscal expansion. And our biggest, I think the focus is on the tax cuts rather than infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment does take time, and that is more as a jobs done by states rather than federal government. So tax cuts, if you take a look at the Trump administration, Trump's advisors saying the views and their policy commitments, income tax cuts, including some de facto income tax cuts, I think the target the whole groups of the income group, the wealthy guys, high income guys, middle class, and low income. So the people who do not spend money is people who do not like Trump. I hate this income tax act because I hate this president, so I don't want to spend money. But if the people get money, they spend money, even though they voted against Trump. We're going to see pickup in PCE consumption in the States. That would be really stimulative. But that is really inflationary. So the point is, in this environment of the very mature medium-term cycle in terms of recovery in the States, now fiscal expansion is kicking in. Somebody has to help to mitigate inflation pressure. Europe, China, we need Europe to go down. It's not kind of risk on-off scenario. We would like to see Europe to slow down because now the US is overheating, possibly. Somebody will come and say, okay, you're overheating, so we are now slowing to help the global interest rate not to picking up much. But if the Europe does not do such a thing, or if the China is okay, global GDP growth rate would shift upward. Even Japan, they have decided to postpone VAT hike. They have decided to introduce fiscal package. The same situation. Japan jobless rate is already 3.0%. It's going down to maybe 2.6, 2.7 by the end of next year. And everybody has been saying, no, Japan will not see any inflation. We have had a view that inflation is not coming in Japan because we are aging. We are having a fiscal policy which is tended to cut the prices of public works, for example, and part-time is now rising, so no inflation kicks in. But remember, again, the cyclical wise, we are already at the very mature stage of the 8-year cycle usually. We are already getting to 9th year, second half of next year. So the risk is again on the upside for Japan as well, on inflation. So US may be a bit more inflationary, and same situation in Japan, but more inflationary. And this central bank of this country has been scared of the deflation. They might be wrong, totally wrong. And then, in the second half of the year, you'll be shocked. We'll just start to raise interest rates, cutting QE, and very volatile exchange rate markets. So I would say, the Takeda-san's range of 105, 125, I very much like, but I think I would say 130, 90. Kind of a number. It's a very volatile market. And also, we're going to see probably the very volatile bond markets. BOJ will fail in communicating with markets. It's very difficult for them to communicate. I think if you're a governor, and if the 130 kicks in, and inflation pressure kicks in, and what are you going to do? You're going to try to gradually raise 10-year interest rates? Is that the case you do? No. Remember that if the US rate is 3% for 10-year, for example, if the Japan is 0, difference is 300 basis points, and maybe 125 yen to dollar. Are you raising 10-year target by 10 basis points? It's just crazy. Because before reaching 3% with 10-year interest in the United States, starting with 1.8, for example, already 120 beeps increase in the United States interest rates. Is Japan adjusting interest rate level by 10 beeps against 180 beeps rising interest rates in the United States? I don't think so. It's nothing for the market people. Means central bank may have to raise 10-year target by 50 beeps, for example. It's a shock to the bond markets, I think. But if that shock is unacceptable for the government, for example, they are now relying on zero interest rate to fund deficit, and putting pressure on the BOJ, no, you cannot raise 10-year target by 50 beeps. You have to stick to 10 beeps only. Means yen could remain even weakish for longer. But if the yen remains weak for longer, more inflation pressure, and suddenly BOJ forced to do more aggressive tightening monetary policy. So this policy of the central bank will not work in our view. Finally, market will get mad and say your printing money policy will be really attacked by the market or has been wrong. The problem with the central bank right now is that they do not want to admit that their policy is so potentially so damaging to the market. So I'm very much interested in what the Kuroda-san will say next week. Is he saying 117 is too much, or is he saying 117? Oh no, not a problem. But the point is, that instability of the bond markets and currency markets would be the case. Understand. This is the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is that the economy, again, will be okay because of fiscal expansion, VAT hike postponement, and also if the U.S. economy does better, not necessarily hugely, Japan would benefit somewhat. So the growth rate would be on a current day basis next year. We're going to see probably very close to 1% probably growth next year. Risk on those outlook. Of course, we expect some volatility over the bond markets. I think the one thing we have to be careful is the number one, the U.S.-Japan relationship. I think the regime is now changing. This is my personal view, but a Trump administration seems to be more interested in deregulation in general. And even though they look protectionist, I do say that that protectionist type of actions could be or could change in a way that putting more pressure on other countries rather than just protecting their industry. And Japan-US relationship, in our view, one big problem right now is the auto trade surplus with the state. Japan's trade surplus, I think roughly speaking, 70% is the auto-related surplus. So that could be the focus next year. And also agriculture product imports from the state. Should we buy more Californian rice? Should we eat more Californian rice or what? Energy related, yes. Should we import more energy from the state? So I think the trade relationship with Japan and US could get significantly worse than now, depending on Abe's stance on China and Russia. The new administration states, in our understanding, will be taking a rather hardliner stance on China. In the meantime, the fairly friendly with Russia. So far, I don't know. I mean, it may change, but means we, Japan, may be forced to follow that direction of diplomacy. And if we cannot do that, the new administration may say that why you do not, import more Californian rice? Why you do not import more, U.S. energy-related products? Why you do not do a bit more deregulation on the medical side, for example? Or why, would you not buying more U.S.-made cars? We once did back in the 80s. Toyota tried to sell GM's car. I would say I've never seen, I never saw that time the people bought US car in Japan. But again, that kind of thing could happen. So the very interesting thing is that I think the diplomacy and economic policy would be interrelated. So that is of course a risk of the economy into next year. And also on this, we very much focus on U.S.-China relationship next year. So I don't say this, the issue is really a big issue next year so soon, but of course, I think the people will more focus on the geopolitical risk in this region. We have focused on the Europe and maybe Middle East and a bit of the maybe Latin American economies maybe, but next year, Asia. Because I think the new administration of the States looks most, the provocative on Asian policy probably. So that is, I think, not necessarily the huge risk on the economy for Japan, but in the meantime, we have to really closely monitoring, and that will be again affecting Japan-U.S. relationship, including trade and even the opening of the markets, deregulation policy, and blah blah blah. So my worry is, has Abe administration been prepared for such a big regime shift, regional changes, and so on? It's not something which can be resolved by just gifting a golf club to Mr. Trump. the balance is so different. I think the one thing is really big thing we have big thing we have, and golf club is, he's a billionaire. He can buy anything himself, right? I stop here.
All right. Thank you very much for that quick run around the world and the economy. So I don't think we quite have Clinton versus Trump here, but we do have two slightly different views on the Forex direction, either 105 to 125 or 130 and above. So a lot to ask about. So let me open the floor to questions from the working press. Please be sure to state your name and affiliation. Who's going to be first? We are a quiet group. Working press, yes. It's your last chance. Stefano will ask one, yes. We haven't mentioned Italy, so.
So thank you. My name is Stefano Carrera for the Italian economic daily newspaper, Il Sole 24 Ore. Two questions. For next year, how do you think the Europe factor could affect the markets in Asia? Because there will be very important elections in key countries, and that could, I don't know, have some effect. And how strong could be this impact? And the second question is about, people are thinking when the BOJ will start actually tapering or introduce some form of tapering. So probably to raise the target on the 10-year bond yields could be considered tapering, but just specifically because we need, some headline. So when do you think that BOJ could start tapering? Could be next year or not? Thanks.
Okay.
So maybe I take the first question.
Sure.
Then the impact on the European situations. I can point out many things, but first comes the political risks, because as we all know that the election schedule being so, in Germany, in Netherlands, France, and Germany. So the point is the domino of populism will continue in continent Europe or not. That happens in UK this year in June, and then went to cross Atlantic, then go to the US. So return to the European continent of a populism of domino would be the key factors. So this is very serious and important thing, I think. And the other story is the financial stability. Again, Italy, they have very serious, non-performing loan in Italy is over nearly 20%. That's the worst moment in Japan in 90s was just 8%. So you can see how serious that the banking crisis and the problem in Italy is. So if the financial system being in trouble in Europe, then that could be widespread globally, because now, globally speaking, one of the largest problem is excessive of debt. In globally, there is a $125 trillion debt globally. That's a lot in recorded in history, of course, and the per GDP it's over like 220% or something. So we are all talking about additional easing and quantitative the asset purchase stories, but on the other hand, the reality is that we are facing huge debt. So once financial system in trouble, that's going to be a very serious, spread. Contagions, and because these debt stories are mainly in emerging countries, and their financing being from European banks. Their financing denominated in US dollars. They are not, the majority of them are not coming from US bank, but from European banks. So if the stability in banking and financial stability was worsened in Europe, that's going to be a global problem. That's my take on the European impact.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think from the financial market perspectives, I'm a bit doubtful about any the European risk damaging the financial markets. Of course, it depends on how that's serious, but our American team was actually wrong in predicting that the huge risk of happening if Trump won. No, totally opposite. The Brexit, everybody said, well, this is the thing, the sky is falling, I think everything will be really, unstable or something really bad happening. No. So, if things happen twice, things could happen 3 times. Or the third time would be different. That is your call, not our call. But the point is the financial market situation is interesting because I think the interesting right now is that US is gradually tightening monetary policy. Japan, US still printing money. Global economy is now picking up. In that situation, and if people believe that US is accelerating, late high could be all right. And if the US, Japan, and Europe are printing money, I think the market people cannot be easily caught by a risk-off scenario. So one possibility is, if everybody talks about, wow, French election would be the risk, Italian banking system risk, but if Italian banking problem has been gone through by some capital injection, for example, wow, positive, buy equities. If the French election ends up with something slightly moderate than expected, wow, the event is over, buy equities. That could happen. This is my view. And on the BOJ tapering, I think the BOJ tend to change monetary policy in January, April, July, or October when they do print quarterly economic report, publish quarterly economic report. I think there's a possibility for the BOJ to start, taper or decide on tapering in January and the end of January, depending on how the exchange rate pans out from here. But our base case view is maybe in April. They're going to take another quarter of wait and see. Means there will be limited chance for them to decide on starting tapering of QE during Q1 calendar next year. So our base case is April, but risk is as early as in January. And tapering has to have some definition. Tapering is, of course, currently they're printing money at a pace, roughly speaking, 80. They don't necessarily have already the monetary base target, but they are now buying the JGB at the pace of 80. Tapering would mean maybe 80 is going down to 70, 60, 50, 40. And the point is that whether or not they will show some projected path of tapering. That is a key. If they only say, okay, we're going to do 70 for the moment, that is not necessarily that a big change. But if they say, okay, we're going to do by every quarter, cut 10 trillion yen, something like that, that is a big issue for us because I think that would help market formulate expectations for the monetary policy. And also the point is the tapering would be accompanied by the late hike or target hike for 10-year in our view. So kind of a simultaneous decision of the tapering and some upgrade to the 10-year interest rate. And again, base case is starting in April.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Neidhardt. Just following up what you said just now, Mr. Shirakawa. If, as you said before, it shows that the BOJ was so wrong sometime next year, and they start tapering, and maybe they have pressure to taper rather rapidly. On the other hand, the government is counting on 0%. So there's already a rift between the BOJ now and the government now, but this rift will get much bigger. So would you please spin that thought on what's going to happen then? I mean, the government needs a 0% interest rate, doesn't it?
Well, yes, I think the BOJ may want to, again, or will be forced to taper QE fairly quickly, adjusting to the new environment of the weaker currency, in my view. But in the meantime, of course, the government will not want them to taper so quickly. Our view is that if the government pressure on the BOJ is to keep the zero interest rate for longer, I think risk is always on the downside on the yen, and risk on the upside on the inflation. Somewhere at some point, the government has to say, okay, we have to accept some tapering and rate hikes because we need to kind of control inflation expectations. But the risk is always on the side of the delayed action because of political pressure from the government. But again, this is the darkest side of this policy because we're helping the government by zero policy, but somewhere at some point inflation pressure kicks in, and then they will get in trouble. So this is something which you have to be really, I think, aware of. Structurally, to some extent, I think the structural problem of this monetary policy, and we have to go through at least once a very volatile bond market to get some stable markets, and then I think in that situation, in our view, government has to accept some increase in interest rates, and our interest is if the interest level shifts upward, when a situation the potential GDP is not necessarily going up. That means we need more economic reforms or something structural on the supply side to boost potential GDP. The very healthy correction of the market could be the case. I am personally a bit more conservative than liberal, and that would be needed. Why not we punch the first government, and then why don't you do more reforms? Just relying on the cheap, easy monetary policy will no longer sustainable. But anyway, that point is very important, and I do think that delayed and sudden change and government will be forced to accept maybe.
If I add something to this, is very monetary policy specific discussions. It's true if we just focus on the monetary policies, but to revive or to revive the economy or to defeat deflation, the monetary policy is not the only solution. We need, and it's not almighty. So what we need is structural reform, so-called 3 arrows of Abenomics. So I quite often use these charts to explain this, but in Japan, because this chart on the right-hand side, the red line is a capital investment, and the gray line is a corporate profit. So as you know, that the Japanese corporates, they are record high profits during the past few years. But look at the red line. The capital investment is so small, and compared to what happened in early 90s, because it's quite opposite. I call this the lack of animal spirit. So to revive this sense in Japanese, decision making in the boardroom, we do not need more monetary policy, maybe, but for structural reform. So I think, just to tell you, the monetary policy is not almighty.
Yes. A quick follow-up.
You say it's not almighty, the monetary policy. It's just the opposite. The last 4 years have shown that monetary policy is rather powerless. And would you go as far as next year we will see that even the first arrow was actually a failure?
I assume that is a question. It's getting close, but never mind. Yes. Any views on that?
Well, I'm first of all, I'm not a supporter of the monetary deflation. And secondly, what has happened under Abenomics is that the money printing temporarily lead to depreciation of the currency, and the import inflation kicked in, and purchasing power of consumers actually deteriorated, and combined with the unfortunate increase in tax rate. consumption was actually killed. So, the ineffectiveness of the monetary easing is that it is effective on boosting import inflation, but it is not effective in boosting production, employment, or exports, for example. And also import inflation that's sustainable because of import inflation killing consumption, killed consumption, just as pushing down in inflation rates. So it's not at all sustainable. And then the side effects or adverse effects is that this money printing actually helping the government, and the government does nothing in structural reforms. Just a waste of time. And we actually wasted another 4 or 5 years. And the problem is nobody would take responsibility. Who is going to take responsibility? And the problem is, no matter what is the reasons behind the inflation, any inflation is fine. That kind of view is wrong. Cost inflation and demand inflation also different, and also more, I think the potential GDP related inflation is also so different. So any inflation is fine. Just import inflation is fine, and it's not sustainable. So I think from the beginning they're wrong. Sorry, but they are wrong. Already it has proved they were wrong, I would say. I repeat.
They were wrong, in case anyone missed that, okay? That leads on to another issue, though. You mentioned that you see a risk on the upside for Japanese inflation. You think it's going to be the wrong inflation. What's the impact going to be of your outlook on the economy? Because this hasn't been talked about much recently, but you raised it the wrong inflation where people actually aren't any better off and they see prices going up, they don't see wages going up, so they're probably going to spend even less potentially. What is the scenario you see if they indeed hit this 2% inflation that's basically cost driven?
Well, I think what we expect next year is another, I think start of another round of the import inflation because of the yen depreciation, plus somewhat, I think, the better inflation from the wage pickup. So the situation would be, I would say, slightly better than we saw in 14 and 15. But the wage inflation is also, as you know, the shortage of labor. And again, it is not necessarily that a good thing, because I think the shortage of labor is just pushing up inflation means anyhow it is more or less accompanied by the decline in potential GDP. So the one hope is that if the wage inflation kicks in, it's not necessarily that visible, maybe only if non-regular workers' wage increases, but several different scenarios after that. One, more capital investment by companies to replace labor. So more innovation in the service industry. That is one possibility. Second possibility is that the way of hiring people may change, shifting a bit from the part-timers to full-timers maybe, but the number of workers could decline because I think the companies look at more of the quality of labor. Third possibility is that inflation leads to even higher participation of labor by women or aged people. But in our view, the baby boomers are now getting into a 70-year-old and plus cohort. So means participation of labor would not increase much. 65 to 69 cohort, some decent high participation. But if the baby boomers getting into 70-year-old and plus cohort, significant decline participation rate. So supply of labor would be hitting a wall by around the end of next year. That's what we are saying. Wage inflation kicks in. But again, I think our biggest hope is that the service industry may be shifting more toward the capital investment to improve productivity of labor or to replace labor by capital. But what we do not know is what kind of capital investment they need. It's not necessarily the simple automation, maybe robotics. I don't know. But that would be kind of the market-led innovation. rather than the government policy kind of innovation. Means tightening labor market is not necessarily a bad thing, because that could be leading to next stage of innovation of this country. So that is our view right now.
Okay, thank you. Takeda-san, thoughts from you?
Oh, yes. Your question, I mean, the inflation story in Japan, that leads to my outlook for a dollar yen of 125, the bit cautious than Shirakawa-san, is because of the inflation stories. And many people understand that the Japanese government and the people always simply welcome weaker yen. I think it's wrong. We had seen that like a year ago when dollar yen tried to reach nearly above 125, 130. That time, the household people, because the weaker currency has damage on their real income. So that hurts the purchasing powers. And the reality is that the macro data, the consumer spending, a bit weakened. This is not the whole reason of the weakening of the consumer spending, but the weaker currency means weaker purchasing power. So it's not all the good stories to have the weaker yen, weaker currencies. So, and on the other hand, the pressure on inflation next year is of course not downside but upside, because the impact on weaker oil, the year-on-year impact on oil prices will be gone. So maybe Japanese inflation close to CPI close to 1% or something. So when the timing of to see that the inflation pressures, though it's very absolute level is very low, but inflation pressures to see again, and weaker currency, it's bad combinations for household and consumer spending or the mid to small companies. So I don't think that's my take on that point.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. One thing as journalists we always look at is not what people are saying, but what they're not talking about. And I remember the BOJ under the other Shirakawa used to put out these surveys that showed that people in Japan wanted deflation over inflation, which made sense because they were net savers, and so therefore deflation was better. The BOJ, I'm not sure if they still produce those numbers, but they certainly don't publicize them the way they used to with their inflation drive on. So it shows that the viewpoint can change depending on the politics. Any more questions from journalists? Oh, yes, one more, and then we're going to go to the non-journalists, because I'm sure we have a lot of good questions there. And no statements followed by, what do you think of my thought?
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. Koichi Hamada wrote an article on this, and I think that it meant not the economy in Japan is in a bad shape. It's only the accounting system. He says with a new accounting system, and then the Financial Times had also a report about it. Japan had a better accounting system, it would show the Japanese economy is growing. So how do you see this?
You mean statistics?
Yeah, the change in the statistical formatting, yeah. To boost the numbers. Or lower the numbers.
Yeah, well, just I think for the GDP statistics released a week ago, they actually changed the way of estimating GDP, and the new statistics now include R&D investment. And R&D investment by companies were actually not included in the previous SNA statistics, which actually pushed up GDP, roughly speaking, 20 trillion yen, or 4% of GDP. And also, they changed the way of estimating consumption as well. And the services expenditure was actually up as well. So more than 30 trillion yen increase in GDP level. And I don't think it's not necessarily only for Japan's case, but the GDP as a concept is the product of the of the country, or the product the country produced or produces. But that product is usually value added But a point is some data were actually omitted from that value-added concept. For example, if you do internet game for free, is that consumption or not? You spend your time several hours per day paying nothing. And actually that expenditure has to be consumption. But why it is not included? Because it's free. But that free, the internet game, for example, has been supplied by what? Corporate advertisement expenditure. It is not included in GDP. So, for example, I think this R&D is also the same concept. Expenditure is not investment, but some expenditure is investment or even consumption. So, I think in that sense, it's not necessarily only Japan's accounting problem. I think GDP can be easily pushed up by such a kind of thing. So the level of GDP, can be raised by that statistical estimation method changes. But a point is that if that changes happen for GDP many times, we'll be confused because I think we always look at debt to GDP, for example, public debt to GDP. The GDP goes up, debt unchanged. So public debt to GDP, for example, goes down, sort of things. But again, the issue is, is that really a important point for us to look at? I don't think so, because I think that always the issue is not necessarily public debt to GDP, for example. It has to be always tax revenue to GDP kind of thing. It is not so different. And the BOJ is more interested in estimating GDP from tax revenue rather than adding up the whole composition by composition, for example. But I think for the monetary policy viewpoint, it is somewhat important because I think if the GDP level is really big or much bigger than the current level, way of doing monetary policy could be somewhat different because debt to GDP doesn't matter somewhat and sort of things. But the point is, what has not been counted as a GDP is from here on mostly some expenditure at free. Means if you include that transaction, prices would go down and makes 2% inflation targeting even more out of dated. Why we have to target 2% inflation? Because I think that many things are now free. If you include that transaction in price indexes, I think it is definitely pushing down inflation indexes. So I would say chasing 2% inflation is wrong from that sense. So I don't know. I haven't heard Hamada-san's view on that side, but I think I would like to ask him that if that's the case, are you still, in favor of achieving 2% inflation? 2 is not necessarily that realistic already.
Okay, Takeda-san, what do the number crunchers at IIMA think about all this?
Okay, I do not have much to say on this, but it's true. Macro data is not so accurate. It's maybe the global stories. Because this is about the GDP issue, but a year ago we were discussing about the Japanese CPI. We do not, their treatment on the imputed rents is wrong, or how come we do not use any big data? These stories are just circulating. And also, if I mention something from Europe, the shadow economy, or said the GDP percentage of their not counted in GDP is like 30% in Italy and Spain. And Greece, maybe more. So if we just focus on these inaccuracy of the macro data, then maybe I lost my job. So that's the reality, and and let's say China, nobody trusts in that their macro data, but we use the data they release. That's only thing we can do. So that's the reality.
Okay, this gentleman over here, I did promise a chance to. If you could give us your name and affiliation.
Thanks, William. Tom O'Sullivan, Associate Member. I wanted to ask Shirakawa-san, just to go back to the United States again. There's been a lot of discussion around, the equity markets. Obviously, the United States is up by $1 trillion, Europe's up by another $1 trillion possibly. But what about the bond markets globally? Are they down by a corresponding amount? And what will the impact be on the economy if this continues for for a long time. And secondly, I wanted to ask Takeda-san, she talked about the Trump stimulus, 6 trillion of tax cuts and 1 trillion of infrastructure spend. I mean, how feasible is that in the context of the United States, do you think?
Okay, thank you. Shirakawa-san, over to you.
Well, I think your question is on the market or?
On the market.
Yeah.
The valuation of the bond portfolio.
Yes. Well, the U.S. economy is expected to reaccelerate, in our view, to maybe, this year maybe finishing at maybe 1.7% GDP growth. Next year maybe mid to 2%. So that means a more or less like 0.8% shift in GDP growth maybe, and inflation rate I would say they're accelerating as well. So it is not necessarily that strange for us to say 10 interest rate level goes up by roughly speaking 1 percentage point into next year. And what is the base rate for the U.S.? I mean, I would say 1.5% for 10 year would be too much, too low. 2.5 this year would be a bit too much maybe. So maybe kind of, if you base 2%, 3% 10-year interest rate in the States next year on average is not so strange. So it means we tend to think that the markets have not fully priced in the U.S. economic outlook, including fiscal expansion impact. So maybe we're halfway, and the markets tended to move in a very short period of time and then becoming kind of range. So I would expect fairly quick adjustment of the bond markets further, while the interest rate goes up further in a short period of time, then becoming range. And if you think that this year was kind of the midpoint 2%, slightly up, slightly down, we expect the midpoint next year to become 3% and slightly higher or slightly lower. This is a kind of very cyclical view. And one thing I would like to add is that regime shift could happen into year 20, something like that. That is the end of any easy monetary policy in the United States. This is not a cyclical view. This is a structural view. I think I too much appreciate Trumponomics, but a point is that they very much like the free trade, free market transaction, less intervention by the government, even including central bank. And some guys, advisors to Trump, actually believe Professor Hayek is the guy. Totally opposite of the Keynesian. Hayek did say that we do not need any central banks. Any money printing policy is just a cost to the economy. So I would like to say that regime shift in the States could be such that we do more deregulation, but monetary policy has to be more disciplined. Totally opposite. After Lehman shock, we have to do deregulate, more regulation, you cannot lend money, but then Fed has to keep interest rate level quite low. What I would like to say is that regime would be changing. No, we're going to lose regulation, but monetary policy has to take care of the risk of the asset inflation. Please. So this is my personal view, maybe different from her, but I think my personal view is that 3% is not an end of the game. It's maybe 4 or 5% for 10-year interest rates in the States. So I think the way of thinking, we have to change. We are now getting into the new world under Trump, I would say. It's so different. It's not necessarily a sequential thing. Change. And all economists, we have learned IS curve, LM curve, aggregate demand, Keynesian's view. No, those guys are different. Those guys hate Keynesians, actually. That's a very important thing to remember. If I start to talk about this, it takes 1 hour, 2 hours, so I'll stop here.
Well, you're getting on a roll, though. I thought, and you got a few oohs and ahs about the 4 to 5 number, so I think that people are jotting that one down. So you can answer on the first question as well if you like, but you're asked to put on your
the latter one, on the fiscal expansion story you asked, was first of all, that numbers of a fiscal expansion and tax cut and infrastructure spending, it just came from his campaign platform. So it's not sure, as an after January 20th, that platform will continue or not. It's still in question. But if that, and the hurdle is not that, and the first hurdle is that how he could cooperate with Republican, old conservative people. And as far as the appointment stories goes on, we cannot see any, his close relation and ties with old Republican conservative people. So how to legislate his platform is maybe some difficulties he will face, his challenges he face. And the second point is that if, everything is approved by the Republicans, then, but the schedule of the Congress, it doesn't allow him to, or the legislation is not set, maybe until later this year or toward the end of this year. So the positive effect from these, the policies, are not seen, maybe not this year, but toward the 2018. So we have to wait if everything has done as he planned. But in that case, the realization and effect, the pass-through effect into the economy will be a bit delayed and late than the people expected in general now. And the last point is that his infrastructure spending ideas, I think, does that create enough job? Because the frustration at the general people in the States, the job, job insecurity, these problems, is that the job being lost because of migrants or, that's maybe because of the automation, not just the migrant stories. So even though that infrastructure, that's kind of a one-off job creation, or the sustainability of a jobs market is still in question. So that's my take on his policy that is so uncertain still. But that's my...
Okay, thank you. Other questions? We have time for probably one or two more. Mr. Baumgartner comes in from Switzerland.
So maybe I'm working for Swiss television. My name is Baumgartner. Maybe Japan needs IEC. So if there is such a regime change in the US, how will Japan adapt to such a situation when so far nothing has happened with Abenomics?
For both of you, I think.
Yeah, well, the regime shift, I think, is that, if I repeat, the shifting from the bureaucracy-controlled economy and the Keynesian type of prescription to market-based economy with more deregulation. This is, in my understanding, that's going to be the regime change. I do not buy the argument of the protectionism, spreading in the globe because of Trumponomics. So I think the Japan's policy so far, or the even maybe since the burst of the bubble, always the same. Fiscal expansion, monetary expansion, fiscal expansion, monetary expansion. That's it. And government has become bigger and bigger and bigger. And bureaucracy's voices continue to go up. No way we're going back to more market, private sector economy. No free lunch for everybody, even some weak people. So I think this, the regime shift, if it happens in Japan as well, I think the Abenomics, again, first and second arrow will be gone, and third arrow will come up, and the whole policy will be concentrating on this third structural reform thing. But Japan's structural reform always is not necessarily reform, even sometimes a new regulation. So, and because I used to be a bureaucrat, and bureaucrat job is what? Make new regulation. That is their job. Bank of Japan's policy right now is the new regulation. why they have to cap interest rate level. This is a new regulation to the market. So I think the deregulation, the basic economy should require first a big battle between a government. I would say government, not necessarily government. I think the leader of the country and bureaucrats. And Japan's bureaucrats so powerful. So I'm not so optimistic about this new regime shift. But in the meantime, I think Abe-san will be more focusing on deregulation reforms, tax reform, social security reform. Anyhow, I think the pace would be still slow, but direction we continue to see more deregulation. But the point is, we cannot be that, I think, optimistic because of the strength of the bureaucracy. And again, Bank of Japan is including in that bureaucracy, helping the government to make new regulations. That is my point. So we have to also punch the central bank.
How many years were you at the BOJ? I
16.
forget.
16 years.
Just in terms of disclosure? Good? Okay.
Yes.
Takeda-san.
So yes, I totally agree with the observation that Japan is, different stage than the regime change of the all over the world. But I would like to say that the Japan had some experience, already experienced the regime change, but ancient regime to old regime in 2012. What Mr. Abe started was to restore the old regime of bureaucrats, as he mentioned, and government and business people. These golden triangle was the success model of maybe 50s and 60s of Japan. And it seems that Mr. Abe trying to restore that system. And that system is rather working very well. So I don't know. I did some kind of a change, but maybe it's not moving forward or trying to the old success model again. Maybe.
Okay, interesting. Mr. Sieber for the last.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. I'm also a customer of Credit Suisse.
And he has a complaint about his account now.
I want to come back for a moment to the Trump system. We were talking about 6 trillion in taxes and about 1 trillion in infrastructure. How is this going to be financed, and to what extent, and how will it influence the overall debt of the United States, which is quite substantial already? Thank you.
Okay, Takeda-san.
That's my question too.
Give us a scenario for the answer.
I just excluded about the detailed Trump policies because we do not have anything for sure yet for serious analysis on the assumptions, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. So it's still in question. What can I say is that.
Okay. Sure.
Well, I think I'm not the Trump's son's advisor, but the point is their way of thinking is this: we have to increase income to finance this more debt print. That income, if you think zero sum in the growth, we have to get income somewhere. That's the point. So simply speaking, they like to actually totally wipe out trade deficit by reducing imports, increasing exports. There's an income. And that income, in theory, boosts tax revenue and finance. So, and again, if you think that this is a global zero sum, US will get some income from outside of the country. And then that would finance the inside the country income distribution. That's the point. And who is going to help the United States? This is it's not a borrow money from the U.S. people. I think it's borrow money, not necessarily directly from China. What I'm talking about is that I think the actual income has to be shifted to the United States from somewhere. by some cut in export to the United States or some more imports from the United States. But I think this is a direct income transfer would be needed. And Trump administration would want to do that. They do not want to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. That's the point. That's the tricky thing. I think this is a very conservative view. Central bank shouldn't print money. So we have to get our income higher by some other measure, deregulation, trade policy, and then that money would finance tax cuts over medium run. So in the short run, deficit would increase and debt level goes up. But I think some point in the medium run, that would be stabilized. That's their view. So nobody knows. Okay. And we have to help, maybe. So again, we have to buy more imports from California, maybe.
Maybe wine would be a possibility. Oh, we're going to have to end it there, I'm afraid. I'd like, because I promised our guests we'd get them out on time. I'd like to thank you both for coming today and helping to put the FCCJ first, to borrow a motto. And so our annual award for one-year membership, Shirakawa-san, I think this is your fifth, right? So
thank you very much.
Thank you. A round of applause, please. Thank you both for coming, and thank all of you for coming and helping to participate and make it a very lively event. So hope to see you at another Professional Activities Committee event. Thank you.